For the last 45 minutes or so, we're going to have kind of some small group discussions. We've talked a lot about drought planning, and all of you are on some way or another stakeholders in a drought planning process. And we'd kind of like to get a little bit of information for you, things about your conception of drought, how drought is important to your organization, your thoughts on drought planning. So what I'd like to do for this is to break out into smaller groups. We're going to break out into 5 groups.
Just a few of the highlights. Definitely on the drought planning, state needs to take the lead. There are so many entities that are going to be involved in this. Somebody has to lead out and, number one, start to organize this. Now, I got a quick question. Was anybody here in on the original writing of the state plan? Okay, then we can talk freely. Okay? All right. Right. Okay, we'll do that. What we thought to start with, an advisory committee needs to be formed, and this is going to be very broad to begin with. Again, led by the state, Water Resources, Ashley here, whoever it's going to be. See who comes to the table voluntarily. After we see who comes voluntarily, if there's some people that are obviously missing, we need to make a special invitation for them. As this group gets together, there needs to be some very clear and highly structured goals and things that eventually will work into a plan. Now, the plan that is in place can be improved. Was that a nice way to say it? That is polite. We appreciate those efforts of those that have done it, but a few things that where the improvement can be had. More pertinent triggers. And when a trigger is triggered, what does it trigger? What is the action that the real action that happens? Will this plan be something that is a heavy hammer? Is it going to be a mandated thing as far as the actions, or should the approach be more of a buy-in and a participatory thing? And we think the latter. We think that there's a lot of people that are concerned about this and are willing to do the planning that needs to be done for a good drought plan, and we're looking to have buy-in as opposed to it being something that is forced upon them. Defining roles and responsibilities, that was reiterated numerous times. Also, who has authority? Is this something that the cities have to do with their people? Because they'll be in this group. Who has the legislative authority to implement whatever the triggers trigger? We want to, let's see. Right. Okay, so that's the plan. Next thing, data agencies. Use them. Central uses both the National Weather Service and NOAA and NRCS. National Weather Service, NOAA, they're the same guys pretty much. We have a contact with NOAA that a lady named Ashley, which is the best name, right? We decided Ashley is the best name. With all the products that NOAA and the Weather Service have on their websites, it's hard to negotiate. It's amazing what they have. So what I do is I call Ashley, I need this product, and within moments, she will send the link to what I need. And they're very willing to do this and do an absolutely great job. I can be nothing but commendatory for that. All right, also, somewhere in this process, getting the information out, we recommend a PIO. And I'm not sure if that's in the department, DNR, or if it's, what do you have? Do you have a PIO for the whole department? They'll need to take a big role in this. Yeah, because this, you know, we saw in one of the presentations that we have areas, river basins that are in a state of drought, but yet we're not quite sure what's going on there. So anyway, okay, that's my 5.
So some of the vulnerabilities that were important to the group that we talked about, and we did have 3 people in our group who are from out of state, so we didn't talk as much about some of the specific Utah vulnerabilities. But some of these include from the perspective of state parks, the loss of resources during drought. So that could mean, say, some of the small reservoirs that are used for recreation, fishing, and boating. When those reservoir levels get too low, all of a sudden that resource for the public is gone. That also can lead to a loss of jobs from seasonal employees working at the state park. loss of resources temporarily can happen due to closures from wildfire. This is something, say, we've seen in Colorado just this year. She was really making the point of kind of the trickle-down effect of closing resources in state parks, and as that trickles down through the economy and the impact of tourism to these areas. We were talking about in addressing what are other planning efforts that are going on in the state. And there were a couple of good points that were made that they're not necessarily other drought-specific plans, but there's many other types of plans that are mentioning drought and might be related to this process. One of those includes the Great Salt Lake Management Plan, the various basin plans that may have a component of drought in them, and also water conservation plans from water providers that exist now, and that's also a new state mandate for water providers to have conservation plans. So this may be a related effort that's going on here in the future. There was definitely consensus that there is the need for greater drought planning in Utah. I think we've all kind of come to that consensus. That seems to be the general consensus in the room, and one that I've heard quite a bit of. Another important issue is thinking about mitigation efforts to drought, that this really needs to be an important part of drought planning, not just to have responses to drought when it happens, but to be proactively thinking about drought and doing things that can help mitigate the effects of drought before they're most severely felt. And then finally, just talking about who are the appropriate stakeholders to include in drought planning. And an important point that was made was, what is the scope of the plan going to be? Is it still very much going to be a high-level state plan? So ultimately, you don't, for that plan itself, maybe you don't want to include lots of county and local people. But on the other hand, we also made the point of the importance of building some of these stakeholder networks. So while county and local officials may not be directly involved in the implementation or coordination of the plan, these are some networks that need to be developed. So from the state's perspective, they can help monitor drought conditions, and I think maybe even more than monitoring drought conditions is monitoring drought impacts, because there are a lot of drought information resources available that we have a pretty good idea of what the actual physical conditions, say, in southeastern Utah are. But I don't think any of us in this room can say, oh, well, we know what the drought impacts are of this exceptional drought in that part of the state. I think those were the important points.
So the significant impacts of drought. The point was made that droughts are increasing, and so is the population. So it's a really big challenge to have this kind of set supply but increasing demand, and we've got to figure out how to manage that. The main impacts were on tourism and the ag industry. The ag industry includes livestock and range production, as well as irrigated crops, and municipal water, and wildfire. And then there were some issues around thinking about future climate change modeling. There's different considerations, like when we change from snow to rain, how are our systems changing to adapt for that? Like, do we have systems for storage of water when we have relied in the past on planning around snow and snowpack? Did I miss anything important there around impacts? Okay. Vulnerabilities. We had a good long discussion around vulnerabilities. I think one of the key ones that came out to me was the smaller communities might be the most susceptible to the vulnerabilities of drought. And how are we planning to address smaller rural communities? A lot of those communities have dropped out of the water provider systems, is that right? And so they might be particularly vulnerable because they're not connected to a bigger supply system. Any other main vulnerabilities that I didn't capture?
Just longer-term droughts.
Longer-term droughts, right.
The fact that 1 year is usually not a big deal, but if it's more than a couple years or more than the storage capacity, then it becomes a
That's right, and that came up in several of our discussion points. Thank you for bringing that up. Quite a few folks said that we're okay for 5 years, but if it's a longer-term drought, we really don't have the systems or plans or capacity to the storage to be able to address longer-term drought and the vulnerabilities inherent in a system that really only has a 5-year supply, if that's the right word. Anything else? My group? No? Okay. What information do you use to monitor drought and what's needed? Snow-tell sites were common for measuring snowpack, and those are monitored closely. Also soil moisture monitoring. What else? And we got into the issue of water law. The idea that if you don't use the water, it makes you liable to forfeit the water. So people use a whole amount allocated. And I know that that may not be a point in relation to information that's used in monitoring drought, but I think it's a really important point. We're always going to bump up against those policies and legal rights to use water or forfeit the use of water. And so I think we don't often enough kind of look at that bigger issue of water rights, and we think of it as being fixed. Sorry, I've gone off track from what we talked about. But we think of water rights as being, I've got the chair and I've got the microphone, so I'm just going to interview myself here.
It's your talk show.
It's my talk show, right? And it's good this is captured on YouTube also. We think of water rights as being fixed, but I think actually, like in Colorado, there's a lot of, I'm sorry that Taryn's not here, there's a lot of interesting, more flexibility options being tested that you might want to consider in Utah's drought planning processes, is how to work within that framework of rights to make it a little bit more flexible. But we just talked in our group about how the water law can be a challenge when you're trying to figure out more flexible arrangements for dealing with drought. Was there anything else in that particular question around monitoring drought that I missed that was important? Okay. Let's see. Other drought planning activities. The group talked about the state requiring reduction in water use by 2020. And the importance of having some good auditing on current water use in order to have accountability for water use now and in the future. Anything else that I missed? Okay. Yes, we need drought planning. And
I dare someone to say no.
what was that?
I dare someone to say no.
Right, right. Well, we talked about that. Nah, not necessary. But we decided it was necessary. And how state-level drought planning mitigate the impacts of drought? Yes, that's important. Do it well. And appropriate participants. There was some discussion about how it's really important to engage the end users, water end users, and because they're the ones that really determine how much water to use, so they need to be involved, but that's obviously difficult because you're talking about a lot of people. So I don't know that we figured out a great way to engage all of those stakeholders. There was general agreement that this group is a good place to start. And it's important to involve different organizations at different scales and different points in the supply, irrigation companies, the ag sector. There was a suggestion that the St. George Annual Water Conference was a great place to engage because it brings so many people together in the whole water sector. And to start a mailing list of water rights holders, or start with that mailing list, and as a way to reach out to a lot of different folks. And it's not possible to engage everyone, but we need a process to collect information and ideas. So think about the process that we're going to use going forward. Any points to add, team? Okay.
I'm going to take her lead on that one. And my group, if I miss anything, just holler, you know. So when we talked about significant impacts to drought, we had a really good discussion on kind of how ag has been affected with it, having to sell off livestock. Julie did a great job explaining how in New Mexico you can actually track, whether it's economic or drought related, that the ag people selling their livestock has a great impact. We also talked about how the request for needs coming to water conservation coordinators, so Faye Rudishauser at our office had received an increase in emails and calls and requests for help during times of drought. In addition to that, planning for large-scale water projects with the potential impacts of climate change were also discussed as a significant impact. And there was also discussion on how areas with no storage have a greater vulnerability. And now I'm kind of getting into the next one, but when there's a short-term drought, when it's like a year, they'll fill it first, and those with reservoir storage are typically held over to the next year, or when they start feeling the pinch with the reservoir storage. We had a really good discussion on why didn't the drought plan trigger something sooner in our plan right now, and obviously there's some questions on, okay, we could have a better process and everything. But at the end of the day, I think in general, after the big year we had the previous year, we felt fairly comfortable. Our reservoirs are fairly full. And so I think that kind of encouraged, that, what was the word? Kind of complacency that we have experienced, and also was brought up in earlier discussions today. In the next one, we also talked in vulnerabilities, the Great Salt Lake. I kind of coined that as like our canary in the coal mine. It kind of tells us, when we've had a lot of drought and additional depletions, out of it, including potential reuse in the Great Basin. And then in the monitoring question, we feel like there's a lot of really great information, the U.S. Drought Monitor, the Surface Water Supply Index, reservoir levels, stream flow, snow water equivalent. We have lots of data, but I think it's also processing that data and how will this plan use that data to inform what actions. We had a great discussion on what resources will the plan do. Like what does it trigger besides just a group meeting? What does that do to help alleviate drought? So we had a fairly good discussion on that. Yes, on drought planning, we need to do it and do it better. We also talked about the addition of coordination with a variety of groups and stakeholders, additional communication. Then we had a really great discussion on the overall plan should have a purpose, should be actionable. I love the idea of having a living document. It's not something that just sits on the shelf. I'd rather have a Google Doc, right, that we can access and edit and change and adapt as we need to. And just increasing outreach and communication, which kind of leads us to our last question of who should participate and how. We didn't get to engage in that one as much. There was the discussion how there are some areas that use watershed groups or basin councils. I think water conservancy districts play a role in it, obviously state agencies, but I look forward to additional communication with you all and stakeholders to define who should participate. So if I missed anything, you guys can shout it out in my group.
Everything that's been said so far, that's the easy part about where I'm at. I mean, we talked about all of those things. We focused a lot on infrastructure. If we are to have a drought, if we are to, incorporate conservation in the future, what infrastructure needs to be maintained? How do we maintain the capacity in our reservoirs? How do we build new reservoirs? How do we maintain our aging infrastructure so that in the future, when we have capacity issues, we'll be able to meet those still. And so that was a huge focus of what we talked about. Do we build new reservoirs? do we build intertwined systems so that we can run water from Nephi to, Ogden and vice versa? Do we have a regional infrastructure system that can share water back and forth? Because we'll get a lot of water in the Bear River and none in the Provo, and then the other year it might be the opposite. And so what kind of political barriers do we have to break down in order to do that? Because physically, we say it all the time in Heber, we have 10 different irrigation companies we deal with. One company will have a terrible year, and the next company has an awesome year and they have extra water. The one company shuts off in the middle of August, and the other company has water they waste or that doesn't get used. And we could physically we can move that water to the company that didn't make it. But politically, it's a challenge. And so what political barriers are we going to have to break down in order to move water from Provo to Brigham City or whatever it ends up happening? And so, that's going to be a challenge in the future. We focused a lot about ag. It seems like, and Mark mentioned it, ag is constantly in a drought condition. There are a lot of agriculture systems that never reach the full amount of water they need to develop the crops for the full season. And so when we're in a continued drought, how do we decide who gets the water? How do we decide if it goes to lawns and gardens or agriculture? What lifestyle choices do we need to make to conserve and meet drought conditions? So the other thing we talked about was conservation. When we're talking about conservation, do we talk about conservation to the point where we're so tight on our water demands that if we have a drought, we have nowhere to take it from. We have no buffer. Is that wise? Should we be conserving all the way down to what a single household needs? And what kind of buffers should we have in agriculture and in municipal systems? We talked about education to homeowners. A lot of homeowners, I hear all the time from homeowners that, hey, don't worry about me, worry about those farmers who never shut their water off. They water 24/7, and they leave it in the same spot for 12 hours, and then they move it to the next spot, and they leave it in that spot for 12 hours. And from my standpoint, I've scheduled that farmer to irrigate the appropriate duty based on the state engineer. But a homeowner will always say, those guys are wasting a lot of water. And the ag guys are saying, hey, those homeowners are wasting a ton of water because they water every day for 30 minutes. And so education is a huge part of drought planning and a huge part of conservation. And we also talked about metering and SCADA and those kinds of things to help educate. One of the important things we feel like is learning from other states. Utah, let's be honest, we're in a pretty good shape right now. We've got pretty amazing reservoirs up in the snowpack. We've got reservoirs that we've built to hold the snowpack. The water's delivered to our doorstep. Gravity, it's good, it's clean, cool water. So we're in a good spot right now, a lot better off than some of the other states. So let's learn now from what the other states are going through. Some of the things that have worked and haven't worked in the past. So we're grateful the other states are here to start helping us plan. The other thing in drought planning, like everybody else has said, is make sure we look out for the little guys, right? It's pretty easy to get lost here in the Wasatch Front, major population. It doesn't feel bad right now. You talk to people and they're like, dude, we just got a thunderstorm yesterday, drought's over, right? But there are people in our own state who rely on agriculture for their livelihood that have had 10% of the water that they usually get or 20% of the water they usually get and are done. And so what kinds of things do we do to help those areas? and how do we make sure that what we're planning isn't pushed from here out? How do we bring those people to the table? I guess the other thing, conservation. A lot of times we think conservation means more water in the streams, more water available to the environment. Does it really? Or does it mean we're going to build more homes? So what role does conservation play in our drought planning? The other impact, one of the other impacts we talked about was, what impacts does drought have on water providers? We all know if you provide water to anybody, the amount of water you sell or the amount of water people use is the amount of revenue you get. The district's got a lot of debt. Other companies have a lot of debt. Do we want to conserve below what we can pay for the water we've developed? And how does drought, if we have a drought and we don't have the water to pay for our debt, how do we fund that in the future? Or how do other water providers, or does the state step in? What kinds of things do we do to help fund water providers if there's no water for revenue? I guess the last thing, the main takeaway is there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. Not every solution is positive. Some solutions have negatives as well. And so it's about finding a balance, finding out where the middle ground is, and opportunity costs, I guess, and seeing where we have to go and where we can go. So yeah, I think that's it in my group.